Dan Walters has been a journalist for nearly 60 years, spending all but a few of those years working for California newspapers. At age 22, he was the nation's youngest daily newspaper editor. He joined the Sacramento Union's Capitol Bureau in 1975, just as Jerry Brown began his governorship and later became the Union's Capitol Bureau chief. In 1984, he and the column moved to the SAC-B, and in 2017, Walters and his column shifted to calmatters.org. Walters has also written about California and its politics for a number of national publications, including the Wall Street Journal. Walters frequently appears on CNN, Fox, and other networks, commenting about political developments in California. In 1986, his book, The New California, Facing the 21st Century, was published in its first edition and became a widely used college textbook. He's also the founding editor of the California Political Almanac and the co-author of The Third House, Lobbyists, Money, and Power in Sacramento. Mr. Walters' Athenaeum presentation is co-sponsored by the Rose Institute of State and Local Government at CMC. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Walters.
Thank you very much, and nice to be back in Claremont again. Nice weather and snow-covered mountains. God, they used to say that that's what made people come to California. They watch the Rose Bowl on New Year's Day and it's snow-covered mountains and sunshine, and they say, well, this is where I want to go. So the topic that is yours today is Jerry Brown, and a pithy topic it would be. I could probably talk about Jerry for a couple of hours, but I won't do that. I'll kind of give you the Cliff Notes version of Jerry Brown's political career and what does it all mean? Does he have a legacy? What is that legacy? You actually have to kind of separate, I think, logically separate Jerry's political career into two parts. Obviously, the part that ended with his defeat for the U.S. Senate in 1982, but included two presidential runs as well as successful campaigns for the Los Angeles Community College Board, Secretary of State, and governor twice. And of course, the second incarnation began about 17 or 18 years later when he came out of obscurity, self-imposed exile, although another presidential run in 92, and ran for mayor of Oakland. Thence Attorney General, thence the governorship for the second time, culminating last month in his retirement and Gavin Newsom's accession to the governorship. I was trying to explain to these young folks here how it is that Gavin Newsom is Jerry Brown's nephew, but it's a long, complicated, as they can attest. They can tell you, they can give you the version. But essentially, Jerry Brown is Gavin Newsom's uncle, in the sense that the Brown and the Newsom families, along with the Pelosi family and the Getty family, have been intertwined for generations. And just as Nancy Pelosi is Gavin Newsom's aunt, so is Jerry Brown Gavin Newsom's uncle, which gives credence to the notion that it's all a fixed game anyway, and that San Francisco controls everything in California politics, which may be true, by the way, So anyway, those two parts, and I think they're separated not only by about over 2 decades of interim, but also two almost polar opposite versions of Brown. Jerry Brown, the first time, I'll call him Jerry Brown 1.0 for lack of a better phrase, was the epitome of a grasping, ambitious young politician. He ran for the school board, or the community college board, and moments later started running for the Secretary of State, and then moments after that started running for governor, and moments after becoming governor decided he wanted to run. Less than a year after becoming governor, he was off running for president. And he did it again in 1980, and then at the Senate. So in a way, in a very real way, because I lived through it, so I can attest to it, in a very, very real way, his first governorship was one long political campaign with very brief and not particularly productive interims of governance in Sacramento. He had ambitions, he voiced ambitions about being a transformative governor. But after being catching a case of Potomac fever, those kind of ambitions more or less went away. What he accomplished in his first incarnation as governor is pretty much confined to almost his first year as governor, 1975, when he particularly in signing two very historic pieces of legislation. Yeah, there were more than two, but they amounted to two different things. One was collective bargaining for farm workers. The other was collective bargaining for teachers and other public employees. And after that, things just kind of frittered away. He tried a few things kind of half-heartedly, most notably trying to win legislative approval, and did win legislative approval to no avail, of a peripheral canal that would carry water from the Sacramento River around the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta to the head of the California Aqueduct and thence to Southern California, more or less to fill the hole that was left in the state water plan that his father had created. And that was unusual in one other sense, in that he took great pains in many respects during his first governorship to set himself apart from his father. His father wanted to build highways. Jerry stopped building highways. For example, Pat Brown had an expansive view. Jerry Brown preached small is beautiful, the era of limits, and so forth. So in many ways, he was setting himself from his father. And the truth is that they had a kind of a strange relationship that I personally witnessed on many occasions. Seeing the two of them walk into a room for some sort of a political event, stand within a few feet of one another, and never acknowledge each other's existence. But it was a kind of if there was an estrangement, it was kind of a one-sided estrangement, because Pat was very proud of Jerry. I don't know if you remember the movie, The Candidate. Have you ever seen if you're in this business, you have to have seen The Candidate, right? Yeah. Anybody seen The Candidate? Raise your hand if you've seen The Candidate. Okay. Not very many. Well, too many young people. That's the problem. Was that movie by Robert Redford playing a U.S. Senate candidate in California. I think it was 1972. He was the son of a former governor, and the kind of strained relationship between this idealistic young, yes, Robert Redford was young once, young politician, and his father, played by Melvin Douglas, was basically patterned after Pat and Jerry Brown. And very accurately so, because while the old governor, Pat Brown or Melvin Douglas, was very anxious to help his son to succeed in politics, the son was kind of standoffish. And that was Jerry and Pat. And Pat really was proud of Jerry. He would come, I would see Pat at various occasions, and he would say, "How's Jerry doing? How's Jerry doing?" I wanted to say, "He's your son. Don't you know how he's doing?" But there is a scene in the movie version of that. It's exactly those words. Robert Redford father goes to someone, "How's my boy doing? How's my boy?" I've heard Pat say that on many occasions. But Jerry was kind of a little standoffish. In fact, if you look in the Jerry Brown archives from his first term, there are a number of letters from Pat Brown wanting Jerry to do certain things, appoint certain people to positions or take certain positions on things. But the letters aren't written to Jerry. They're written to Gray Davis, who was Jerry's chief of staff, trying to get through to Jerry. So the father did not, Jerry wasn't returning his father's phone calls there or something. There definitely was an estrangement. And you can see the same thing in personality as well. Jerry did and still does, one thing about him that hasn't changed, kind of adopt the attitude of a superior being. Somebody who's just a cut above everyone else. And it's very much like his mother, as a matter of fact, who kind of looked down her nose at lesser beings, while Pat was this kind of backslapping sort of politician. Bernice Brown, I don't think, ever slapped anybody's back, and Jerry Brown didn't either. But at any rate, he really accomplished only those two things, both of which one could say haven't worked out too well. all the efforts to make the United Farm Workers Union a real viable force in labor and in the agricultural industry have failed. They're no more successful today than they were 50 years ago when they were out there marching in the fields. So that didn't work out too well. The intended beneficiary did not really benefit from that for whatever reason. There's a lot of reasons, but at any rate, they haven't. Now, that leaves really the most important ongoing accomplishment, if it was an accomplishment, of his first governorship being public employee bargaining rights, public employee collective bargaining. Now, how has that worked out? Well, it's worked out very well for the unions, and it's worked out very well for the Democratic Party, for which the unions pledge untold millions of dollars of campaign funds, and has helped the Democratic Party become dominant in the state. So one could reasonably argue that Jerry Brown's 1.0's greatest accomplishment was to solidify his party's control of politics in California. Now, it may have happened anyway. Who knows? Might well have happened anyway. But it certainly didn't hurt that effort to have several million unionized public employees contributing money and other resources to helping the Democrats achieve what they have achieved. Now, one could say, well, what about the Janus decision? Is that going to continue? I don't think the Janus decision is going to have as great an effect on union membership and union political hegemony as they fear and as the other side hoped. I think it's going to be pretty much a status quo thing. There'll be some changes at the margins, but I think for the time, for the reasonable going forward projection that the unions will remain dominant interest group in the Democratic Party of California, and that the Democratic Party will be dominant in the politics of California for the foreseeable future. So Jerry runs for the U.S. Senate in 1982 after two failing campaigns for the presidency in 1976 and 1980. If you ever get a chance to, by the way, to view the infamous live television broadcasts from the steps of the state capitol in Wisconsin in Madison in April of 1980, Jerry Brown's live telecast, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. If you ever get a chance to see a tape of that, watch it. It's one of the most spectacular failures in political media history. I can't even begin to describe it unless you haven't seen it. It was a total disaster. In fact, it was kind of recreating a scene from Apocalypse Now, Francis Ford Coppola's masterpiece, having to do when the boat went up the river and they ran into the USO show and on the river. If you've ever seen Apocalypse Now, it kind of recreated that whole scene, wittingly or unwittingly. And so the next day, Bernie Goldberg, who's CBS television correspondent, did a stand-up on it and showed clips from it and what a disaster it was, and finished his presentation saying something like, "It was billed as the shape of things to come, but it was more like Jerry Brown's apocalypse right now." And that was quite accurate. He got one delegate in that year's presidential campaign. And then he goes away and he runs for the Senate. I think it would be fair to say that he probably could have won that Senate seat in 1982 had he not run for president in 1980, and had he paid more attention to his gubernatorial duties, including not screwing up on an infestation of the Mediterranean fruit fly, which was a very big deal at the time. As it was, he had kind of, as he said himself, something like, the people of California want a respite from me, and in many ways, I want a respite from them, after losing that Senate race. And he went into kind of an exile, off to help Mother Teresa, touring Japan, other things. Ran for state Democratic chairman about 1989 or so and won, and didn't last very long. He quit because the 1990 elections turned out poorly for the Democrats, and then he ran for president again in 1992, and then he went to Oakland and eventually ran for mayor. So he comes down from his radio show the day he's going to announce for mayor in his commune, radio studio, home, whatever, on Jack London Square. And he starts off on this, why he wants to run for mayor of Oakland. And he says, and he talks about a freeway that, as he described it, cut one part of Oakland off of another part and made it a kind of a segregated community and so forth. And I said, Jerry, didn't you build that freeway? And he says, I knew I didn't want to see you here today, he said. But he ran and he won, and he had a fairly successful mayoralty. He certainly was hands-on. The disengaged governor had turned into an engaged mayor. And he has said, as he said himself later, it kind of conditioned him to think smaller rather than larger, and be cognizant of things like potholes in the streets and so forth. And that launched his second political career. I personally believe that having Ann Gust by his side played a big role in his returning to politics. And I do believe that a lot of it was to kind of erase the Governor Moonbeam image that he had acquired in his first incarnation. And so he became mayor and then ran for attorney general, as his father had done before him, and immediately started running for governor again, and defeated Meg Whitman, despite the fact that she spent about $150 million on a pretty poorly managed campaign on her part. Jerry was lucky in his second governorship. Jerry Brown 2.0 had a great streak of luck, streak being a recovering and prosperous economy. He was the only governor, in fact, of recent vintage not to deal with a recession during his governorship. As he has pointed out on a number of occasions, saying we're overdue for one. That allowed him to fulfill his one and only major campaign promise, which was to balance the state budget. And did he succeed? Yes, with an asterisk on it. He succeeded in the sense that between a recovering economy and a very sharply recovering economy and a income tax increase that he persuaded voters to pass, temporarily income increase, between the two things, it did generate a tremendous amount of new state revenue over the face of his governorship, allowing him to easily balance the budget. And you understand, in political terms, a balancing budget is a one-year deal. It has nothing to do with the future. We'll get back to that in a moment. And to set aside some money in a so-called rainy day fund, which he also persuaded voters to create against the contingency of another recession, which of course will happen at some point in the undefined future. So did he balance the budget? Did he actually fulfill that campaign promise? Yes and no. He balanced the budget on an ongoing basis. He did leave Gavin Newsom uncharacteristically with a surplus. Virtually every governor in recent history has left his successor a deficit. He left George Deukmejian a deficit. George Deukmejian left Pete Wilson a deficit. Pete Wilson actually didn't leave a deficit for Gray Davis, even though Gray Davis lied and said he did. And of course, Gray Davis screwed up the budget and left it to Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then Schwarzenegger, with the worst recession in history, left a huge deficit for Jerry Brown. And he closed that deficit, operating deficit, with an asterisk. And there are two asterisks. Asterisk number one is if you don't count a tremendous amount of unfunded pension liabilities and unfunded retiree health care liabilities. If you don't count those, if you leave those out of the equation, And the second asterisk is, if you don't understand that by raising those income taxes on the wealthy, he made the state budget even more dependent upon the wealthy, and therefore the effects of a future recession even more devastating than they were during the last recession, which takes a little explanation. When Jerry came into the governorship the second time, personal income taxes supplied, I don't remember the exact number, 55% of the state's general fund revenues. Today it's 70%. And of that 70%, half are provided by the top 1% of California's taxpayers. About 15,000 tax returns out of 15 million tax returns. So he has, by doing what he did, raising the marginal tax rates, he made California even more dependent on how well a handful of rich people are doing in their investments, since so much of their incomes come from capital gains. In other words, the revenue system of California has become more volatile. That's the term of art that's used in Sacramento. At the same time, the expenditure side of the state's ledger has become more rigid, more prescribed by law, saying certain money has to be spent here, 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 and here. And that means that the next recession, whenever that occurs, is likely to be more devastating than the last one in terms of state finances. Last recession resulted in about a 20% decline in general fund revenues. And this one is probably going to be 25-30% decline in revenues. In fact, Jerry's own Department of Finance calculated, and Gavin Newsom's first budget extends, would probably cost the state about somewhere between $70 and $80 billion in lost revenue on 3 years. Jerry's rainy day fund, the main rainy day fund and a couple of auxiliary rainy day funds, top out currently at about $19 billion. And Newsom's going to add a little bit more to that. But let's say he gets it up to $20 billion or $22 billion. It's still only about a quarter of what a moderate recession would cost the state in revenues. So in a way, Jerry traded short-term gain, i.e. balancing the budget that existed at the time he took office, for a long-term potential fiscal disaster. We'll see how that all plays out, obviously, because more than likely, there is going to be a recession sometime in Gavin Newsom's governorship. But that is the official projection. Those are the numbers that, we know how much money is in the reserves. We know the people who do such things tell us what a recession would cost us in revenue. So it really sets the stage for a pretty serious situation down the line. So you really have to put an asterisk by his name when it comes to his accomplishment on that issue that he pledged to deal with as a candidate. Of course, there's other things that he did as governor. He did reconfigure public school finance, K-12 school finance, through the local control funding formula, very awkward name, I think, that provides additional money to school districts with large numbers of poor and or English learner students. I think is a noble way and probably an overdue way of dealing with school finance, because we know there is a huge achievement gap in California's K-12 schools. Huge achievement gap between the 60%, we have about 6 million kids in K-12 education in California. 60% of them are either poor, as designated by their eligibility for free or reduced price lunches, or are English learners. So we're talking about 60% of 6 million, in other words, 3.6 million or so kids. It's a pretty serious number. More than most states even have in their public school system. And obviously they had been falling behind. There was this large achievement gap as shown by academic tests, high school graduation rates, and on and on and on. This was designed to try to make it up. Perfectly logical. But we don't know whether it's worked, and all indications are that it has no effect on that achievement gap to date, at least, after spending tens of billions of extra dollars. Why? Well, there are a couple of factors. Number one, a lot of the money has been squandered. And number two, Jerry Brown refused to monitor how the money was being spent. He specifically refused to put in mechanisms that would indicate whether the money, extra money, was in fact being spent on the targeted, high-risk, high-need students, or was being diverted into other purposes. He called it subsidiarity, borrowing from an obscure Catholic principle having to do with the worth of the individual to justify, typical Jerry, appearing to be high-minded, to justify leaving it alone, letting his local school district spend the money more or less as they wished. And it's probably going to turn out to be a gigantic disaster when we finally find out what's happened or not happened. So we can't really say that's an accomplishment. It's a half an accomplishment. It's a half a loaf. It's going part way, but not wanting to go all the way. And that's been, I think, a hallmark of Jerry's second governorship. Halfway measures, token measures in some cases, half a loaf, but not really wanting to risk going for the whole enchilada, or as my wife would say, the whole Megillah. That's also our cat's name is Megillah. Why? Because I think in his eagerness to bury the Governor Moonbeam epithet hung on him by Mike Royko, the Chicago newspaper columnist, he was willing to go halfway just to be able to check something off of his bucket list. And so he could check off school finance. I've checked that off. Whether it works or not, he's checked it off. Same thing is true with pension reform. He acknowledges this huge deficit in pension financing and proposes a seemingly far-reaching pension reform, but when all the dust is settled, he's settled for a kind of a token sort of reform that still leaves the pension systems, state and local pension systems, woefully short, only about 70% funded of their obligations, and does nothing particularly about the health care obligation. The state alone has about a $90 billion unfunded liability for retiree health care. Another half a loaf. He took a little stab at reforming the workers' compensation system, but just a little stab, just a little bit of a tweaking, not really a full reform of a system that's in bad need of a full overhaul. And so forth. And so forth. So he has things on his record that are commendable, at least on paper. But we won't know for some time whether any of these things that he lists as accomplishments, all the time saying he's not interested in legacy, and legacy has nothing to do with it. We really won't know whether any of these things have any lasting power, or in some cases, such as the budget situation, really was not an accomplishment at all, but in fact, just the opposite. It will take time. We'll know. We'll know sometime. We'll know 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now, for example, if not sooner, whether the achievement gap and the shameful achievement gap in K-12 education is being closed at all. And finally, there are the things he refused to do. He acknowledged the need for it, but basically said, I'm not going to try it because it's too difficult. And that's a fairly substantial list. It begins with reform of the California Environmental Quality Act, which he once called the Lord's work, but turned out to be an agnostic when it came to actually doing it, because it was an immensely difficult, complicated thing involving a lot of interest groups, the environmentalists, the unions, the developers, a whole bunch of people, and he just didn't want to try it. The same is true of something very much allied to the budget, and that is tax reform. He, like Schwarzenegger before him, had two choices when it came to the state's very dangerously precarious budget situation, being reliant on such a narrow tax base as a few thousand wealthy families. Schwarzenegger appointed a commission to study it. The commission came back with a plan to reform the tax system of California, to reduce the reliance on the income tax, to change the sales tax into another kind of a VAT, value-added tax, similar to a value-added tax. That thing was thrown in the wastebasket. Jerry took the other option, which was to set aside a reserve fund that is probably going to turn out to be inadequate. He specifically refused to entertain the idea of reforming California's taxation system because of the heavy political lifting that would be involved. It would be very, very difficult politically, particularly in a state and a legislature dominated by Democrats, to say we should be less reliant on rich people and more reliant on the middle class to support the services, because even though the rich people can take care of themselves, the state is at great risk of fiscal meltdown by being so reliant on such a volatile source of income. He could have done that. He refused categorically to do it. He said it should be done. And he said something along the order, I remember hearing him say, well, if somebody brings me a plan, I'll look at it. But he didn't want to undertake it himself. And I think in a way that's to kind of close out my somewhat jaundiced view of Jerry's twin governorships. I think in a way it's a kind of a shame. You can kind of forgive his youthful exuberance the first time around, his hubris to think he should, having been governor for scarcely a year, he should be running for president of the United States. Where have we heard that before? That's kind of, Kamala Harris? No. But the second time around, he came in with a great opportunity. He was a strong election winner in 2010. He had the wind at his back. He had, people were happy to see him become governor. An experienced person could kind of take over and clean up some of the messes left behind after Arnold Schwarzenegger's unsuccessful governorship and the total disaster of Gray Davis's brief governorship. But he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to take chances anymore. He no longer wanted to tilt at the windmills. He didn't want to do things he thought would be particularly difficult to do. And he was more interested in, rightfully or wrongfully, he was more interested in becoming a global leader of climate change than he was helping fix the education system of California. I think it was a very selfish thing for him to do, a very self-centered thing for him to aspire to kind of some sort of cosmic sort of thing and neglect the more basic responsibilities of being governor of a very difficult state to govern. But time will tell. Maybe all these things will turn out. Maybe his school finance thing will actually close that gap. I don't think it will. There's no indication that it will. I think the pension problem is still unresolved and could really be the monster that eats Cleveland or something down the line. And we will continue to not have a good, strong tax system, one that has a wide base and low rates. Instead, we have a narrow base and high rates. He left a lot of undone and some half done. Maybe he hopes that history will treat him better, put him somewhere in the same neighborhood at least of his father. I don't know. Kind of hard to fathom Jerry sometimes. But I think, in my mind anyway, I think he squandered a golden opportunity in his second incarnation to really fix some of the knottier issues facing California. And I think it's a shame, really. It's a shame. The guy is immensely intelligent. He grasps all this stuff. He understands those issues. He understands it. Maybe he understands them too well, and that's why he doesn't want to take them on. I don't know. But he's retired now. He's off to his ranch house in Colusa. And Gavin Newsom's governor. His nephew, his putative nephew, is now governor. And we'll see what happens. Thank you very much. I think I left about 10 minutes for questions, something like that. Okay, how are we going to do this? You going to do it with a
Yep.
microphone? All
Yep,
right.
we'll go around. As always, students have priority, but if there's any questions.
And thank you for your talk. So, Jerry definitely, particularly in his second term, I think, cultivated image of being sort of the adult in the room, particularly in relation to the legislature, right? And
That's not hard to do in relation to the legislature,
fair.
by the way.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, particularly in that aspect of his governorship, do you think was that kind of just something he was playing up, or is that really fair to say that he was kind of reining in some excesses there? And how do you see that going forward?
I think it's fair to say Jerry was the adult in the room. The problem with being the adult in the room is that sometimes you're too reluctant to take chances. That's what happens when we old people. We're not as willing to take chances as we were when we were younger. But I think when it comes to fiscal matters, he was the adult in the room. He did balance the budget. He did tell the legislature no. He put limits on spending. He had a lot of Democratic legislators who wanted to spend a lot more money than he was willing to spend. He did balance the budget on an operating basis, annual operating basis, which probably could not have happened had he not been willing to be the adult in the room and tell people no. So I give him credit for that. It's a good point that you raised, and I do give him credit for that. But again, you have to put that whole fiscal business in that larger context. Did he leave the state in better condition than when he came in? And the answer is, in an instantaneous sense, yes. In a longer sense range, probably no. And so you have to put that caveat on it. He should have been more adult, I would say, and say, hey, we've got to make more fundamental changes here. Just stopping wasteful spending is not enough. We actually have to make some more fundamental changes in how we finance government in California. He was not willing to do that.
Thank you for your talk. So you noted a lot of issues that Jerry Brown kind of half completed or had half
I'm sorry,
done.
Karen?
Yeah, you talked about a lot of things that Jerry Brown had half completed or half done. Which of those issues do you think that Gavin Newsom is going to choose to complete the work that Jerry Brown started?
Just as Jerry Brown took great pains to set himself apart from his father, Gavin Newsom's taken great pains to set himself apart from his uncle. To date, anyway. We're only talking about a month and a half or so far. He obviously is not enamored of Jerry's two pet public works projects, the bullet train and the twin tunnels that would replace the peripheral canal he tried to get several decades earlier. So those are both being kind of downsized, downgraded, and we'll see what happens on both of those. He's professing to be Jerry-like in terms of fiscal stewardship, of not getting carried away with spending, and I think his first budget reflects that pretty well. But it's easy to do because Jerry left him a lot of money in the bank. When they will find out how he progresses along. One of Gavin Newsom's big problems is that, unlike Jerry, he made a lot of very specific promises when he was running for governor. Very specific. Build 3.5 million housing units. He was going to provide single-payer health care. He was going to provide universal pre-kindergarten care and training of students. He was going to do this, and this. And so far, he's kind of trying to be hedging a little ways away from those things because he can't do all those things. I mean, it's impossible to do all those things. So he's trying to kind of sideways, kind of slip a little bit sideways. But I think will he follow through on Jerry stuff? Quickly in my mind, I can't think of anything that he has proposed so far that really follows through on what Jerry proposed. He says he's going to do something about the housing that Jerry kind of slipped aside. He says he's going to do something about poverty, which Jerry also ignored. I should have mentioned that earlier. He really didn't want to deal with poverty. And he had that kind of Jesuitical, I don't know, whatever it is about poverty, you know, the poor are always with us, and can't do anything about it, and that sort of thing. So I say, so far, he has not indicated he wants to carry through anything that Jerry Brown left behind, particularly. So we'll see how it works. Like I say, he's kind of setting himself apart from Jerry in many respects. Whether Jerry likes that or not, I don't know. Anyone else? Yes, back there.
So, in the past 60 years...
60?
60.
60.
0. Which governor do you think has been either the most effective, the most transparent, the most useful to the citizens of California?
An interesting question. They've all had their strong points and their weak points. I would say, I don't have any direct... I wasn't around for Pat Brown's governorship, nor just a little bit of Ronald Reagan's governorship in terms of reportage. So I have to put that caveat on there. You know, this is gonna surprise some people. I think, in a way, the most admirable, let me put it this way, the most admirable governor of recent vintage in many ways was Pete Wilson. And I'll tell you why. Pete came into office wanting to be a Tory reformer, kind of Earl Warren reincarnate, if you will. He had a notion called preventive government. He wanted to get out in front of problems and deal with them before they became crises. That was his mantra. We'll never know whether he would have been successful because Pete had the unfortunate luck, unlike Jerry, of having an unmitigated series of disasters befall California during his governorship. The worst recession since the Great Depression until the next one came along. Riots, earthquakes, fires. It's like the four horsemen of the apocalypse were riding through California and dragging poor old Pete Wilson behind them. He could have complained, you know. Instead, he just kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, that's the deck, that's the hand I was dealt, and I'll play it. And so he became crisis manager, basically, and never got to do any of the things he really wanted to do. But I give him credit for that. I give him credit for being an adult, understanding his obligations, even though it's not what he wanted to be doing, and he did it anyway. And he was a pretty good crisis manager. So I think if the test of executives is how well they perform in crisis, I think Pete Wilson gets very high marks because he had more crises than all the other recent governors combined by just happenstance. The flip side would be Gray Davis, who mismanaged a couple of crises and got thrown out of office because he didn't want to meet them head on. He wanted to try to massage them rather than dealing with them, an energy crisis and a budgetary crisis, and it cost him his governorship. He learned that risk aversion is the riskiest approach to governance. Pete Wilson accepted the risk, he accepted the duties, and he acquitted them. And I give him, therefore, high marks for that, for doing the job, whether he wanted to do it or not.
All right, I think that's about all the time we have for questions.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.